Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you. My name is Shuan and I'll be chairing the webinar today. If you could all put yourselves on mute, I can see most of you have done that. Thank you very much. We've got a few more people coming in, so you'll see a few more boxes popping up as we go. But I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar today for our webinar called Riparian Real Estate. And this name came to us mainly because I've just bought a new property, and so I've been dealing with a lot of real estate agents. And I thought, well, one of the things about the riparian zone is that it provides a whole range of real estate for wildlife. And so we thought that was a great theme. So today's webinar is going to give you a mix of real estate options, if you like. So we're going to talk a little bit about riverbank homes. And then we're going to talk about homes for birds. And then Ian is going to run us through a project where he's actually working on creating habitat hollows for species up in the Southern Highlands. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming for you today from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. I'd like to acknowledge elders, past and present, and emerging leaders, and recognise their great knowledge and connection to the land that we all care about. The first speaker today is going to be Lori Gould. So Lori, if you'd like to bring up your PowerPoint presentation, that would be terrific. So Lori and I work together on the Rivers of Carbon program, and it's a program that we both love. It's been running for about 9 years now. And this particular presentation is brought to you with support from the New South Wales Environmental Trust. And Lucy Wenger is also talking today, and the three of us work together on a project called Rivers of Carbon Goulburn District Linkages. And if you'd like to find out more about that, we'll provide you with some websites and places to go for more information. So Laurie, I might now hand over to you, and just a little note to people to say that that is me in the kayak there at the bottom of the Breadbow Gorge, which is on the Murrumbidgee River, and it's another of our Rivers of Carbon sites. But over to you, Laurie.
Thanks, Joanne. Well, today I thought I would just go back to the basics and talk about riparian land and define that a little bit, because us in the river restoration field just take for granted, I guess, the terms that we use. So things like what is riparian land may seem really obvious to us, but it's not necessarily obvious to everybody else. So I think it's really important to actually define this, because I've been in seminars before where people have asked that somewhere towards the end of a presentation when we've been using that term all the way through. So riparian land is any land alongside a waterway, which might be a river, a stream, a creek, wetland areas, drainage lines, swampy meadow, or anything that holds water permanently or intermittently in the landscape. And we have a few examples of these. So we've got things like this chain of ponds, which is virtually a little swamp. Much of our landscape was a chain of pond system once upon a time, but through agricultural practices, we tend to drain them to use the paddocks alongside them. And these are now becoming quite the rarity. So part of our work is to try to restore these. We might have wetland areas that are permanently or intermittently flooded, like this one out at Breadalbin. It's a beautiful wetland in that part of the world, just past or just before Goulburn, actually. It might just be a rocky little drainage line that only has water in it from time to time, what we call ephemeral streams or intermittent streams. Or this is another view of the previous one, which is also out around the Goulburn area, which only holds little ponds of water when it rains, and the rest of the time it's quite rocky habitat. So habitat for a variety of different wildlife. So I guess the reason why riparian real estate is so important is it is a biodiversity hotspot in the landscape a lot of the time because of the water. So these are the areas that we like to target in the context of sustainable farming in our case, or in urban areas. They're areas that mitigate heat, they provide moisture and microclimate for the people that live around them. And they're also areas of resilience. So when we're faced with climate change, these areas are areas which provide refugia for wildlife, and also that they're nice places to be. So they tend to be a target area, which is why we focus on them so much. As I said, they're hotspots for biodiversity. So we identify areas, in the work that we do restoring rivers, we tend to focus on the best areas to protect as the highest priority, and then we work our way back from there, and that just provides a better outcome for the investment that we put in. Say, for example, in this case, all the elements are there. You've got the trees, there's the mid-story, there's aquatic plants, there's lots of woody debris, lots of edge plants, which are a bit different to the full aquatic plants. They're sort of emergents. So in a case like this, we wouldn't really need to do a lot. Other areas that are missing those elements, we're trying to put them back. So on a farm, for example, we will identify what we know as the riparian real estate. So in a farm management plan, and this property here, they have actually fenced off all of their riparian areas, with the dam in a paddock being a centre point. And this, you can see, provides connectivity across the landscape through a diversity of vegetation. And farmers then can put stock, for example, in the adjacent paddock. So they also gain a benefit in terms of stock shelter, and the wildlife have places to live as well. So caring for riparian real estate, as I mentioned, we protect the best areas, and then we work back from there to try to reproduce elements that were once in the places that we work. We prioritise areas that have a higher recovery trajectory. So there's a lot of places in the landscape that need work, and we don't have endless resources. So we tend to prioritise the highest, the areas that are most likely to recover. We like to ensure that we're connected to other remnant vegetation in the landscape where a lot of wildlife may reside, and this enables them to move across open areas. For example, woodland birds don't like to move more than about 100 metres between patches of vegetation, and Lucy will be talking about birds later. We also need to, this is an interesting one, because over the last 200 years, we've decided that we need to control our waterways, and so we tend to try to make them go in a certain direction, and through that we might use rock armouring, we might channelise areas, we might dig up our creeks and rivers to try to get them to go in a certain place, but they actually move across whole valleys. So it's more of an acceptance that these creeks and rivers will move during flood. They might change course and go through a paddock that they otherwise didn't. So there needs to be some acceptance of this, and a lot of landholders are now able to for example, fence out large riparian paddocks, and that allows the river to move, but they can still use those for grazing in a conservative way. We remove stock from rivers because cattle love nothing more than to stand in a waterway, and Shuan tells me this week that they actually poo more when they're standing in water because they're comfortable and relaxed, which was a bit of insight. Thanks, Shuan. So we try to get those off, and also there's certain diseases and things that affect water supply. It's not only the loss of soil from their hoofs, but they also promote disease, which then affects our town water supplies. So one of our projects for Water New South Wales in the Sydney water catchment actually aims to remove stock from the waterways that supply Sydney's water. And then we will do things like revegetate, manage weeds if they're a problem, and try to reproduce the elements of a functioning system. And then we need to wait for a bit. We give nature time to heal and trust that it's going to, and we certainly have a lot of research that underpins that. We also have to do a bit of maintenance along the way, of course. And then also a big part of all of of managing rivers is to seek support from others and inspiration from others. So instead of the experts always going out and telling us all what to do, we work with expertise based on science, but then also the lived experience for a collective wisdom. So as you can see here with the horses here on the water, there's absolutely no river vegetation. There's erosion. The area is generally being pugged up, as we call it, which just means that the hoof prints and everything absolutely trample vegetation and reduce habitat for things like the aquatic insects that hold up the entire food chain. And so what we like to do is try to manage those animals so that they have good pasture to eat, they have shelter, and they have good water quality by not being in there. So an area like this, for example, where this river's been fenced off, the stock have good shelter from wind, they have good grazing, and the water supply will still come from the creek, which will now be cleaner, but it will be provided through troughs in the paddock. So communication is the key in terms of looking after our waterways, and it's interesting because we have a tendency to think that rivers need to be neat and tidy, well manicured, but in actual fact they're really quite simplistic, and because of that they now store around 2% of the carbon that they once did. So what we have is a campaign called Mess It Up and Slow It Down for land managers, and the idea is that natural river systems are quite messy, but by being messy, they have lots of diverse elements that help to retain water and water quality and reduce nutrients and store carbon. So they work in a functioning system, as I mentioned earlier. So here's a simple, neat, tidy river, and I know it looks beautiful, but really there's very little function, very little carbon store, and quite a bit of erosion in there as well. Very low wildlife value, basically. Whereas the systems that we want to promote are complex, messy and diverse. And you can see there's all the different elements. There's grasses and shrubs and trees and rocky habitat and woody habitat. And it just provides habitat for a broader range of species, which then work together to, as I mentioned, underpin the whole food chain, which then keeps water clean through a complex explanation that I won't go into now. But basically all of the elements work together to clean our water. And those are really good wildlife habitat areas as well. So I'll just hone in on two of our lovely little critters. Platypuses like areas that they're not quite so fussed about water quality, but they do need habitat. They need the banks for their burrows. They need a diverse range of aquatic insects, which that depend on having a diverse range of vegetation. And they're quite an interesting little critter. They prefer crayfish, so obviously there needs to be habitat for crayfish. So it's not about just providing habitat for the end species like the platypus, it's for all the macroinvertebrates, it's the crayfish. It's having habitat for them in the form of banks, and it's giving them, I guess, area to move, because these little things will move up and down streams for kilometres. So it's having that connectivity across the landscape for their habitat. My particular favourite is rakali, and it's commonly known as the water rat, and lots of people think, ooh, rat. So we've now started, they're more aligned in biology to an otter, perhaps. It's like Australia's otter, we like to call them. And similarly to the platypus, they need the banks. They need the insects, but these guys also really like freshwater mussels. And in the ACT, freshwater mussels used to be quite large, but as water quality's declined and habitat's been modified, the mussels are actually getting smaller and smaller. Luckily for us with the rakalis, they're a real generalist, so they can adapt, and they will even sneak in and eat people's picnics at times, I'm told. So they're quite an adaptive little critter, but again, they need these important riparian areas to survive. Around the Canberra area, if people are from this area, we do have them at the Jerrabumbra wetlands in the Wollondilly River there, and there's also 3 platypus that live there as well. And so because the area is protected and the conditions are good for these animals, we're lucky to still have them in our landscape. And of course, we've got all the other critters, turtles and a huge range, which we will possibly do a seminar on in the future because they're an interesting little creature. But things like logs for them to sit in, rocks, they're not quite so fussy about their banks and things. They can live in quite a lot of different locations, but they still need to be able to move around the landscape. So where there might be a waterway right next to a road may not be ideal. And so there's other things in the landscape we need to think about when we're managing for the more mobile species. So I might leave it there and pass on to Lucy, who's going to talk about birds. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Laurie. Have we got any questions for Laurie, just while Lucy takes over the screen and we talk a bit more about birds? So Laurie's provided us with an introduction as to why riparian areas are so important. And Laurie, if you stop your sharing, oh, there we go. That's excellent. The little stat about the cows, 5 times more. A cow will poo 5 times more standing in water, and that is actually an academic paper. So I don't know who the poor PhD student was doing that work, sitting and watching cows all day. But yeah, 5 times more, and it's an animal behaviour thing with cows. They just really like standing in the water, whereas if you think about sheep, much less likely to stand in the water because they actually feel vulnerable, whereas the size of cattle mean that for them it's just a really nice place to hang out. Okay, there's no questions coming up in the chat right now, so we might move on to birds. So Lucy, thank you. And Laurie will stay on the line for questions at the end as well. Thanks, Lucy.
Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy. I work for Greening Australia, and I've been working on some of the Rivers of Carbon projects with Joanne and Lori. So I grew up in Canberra and used to go every week with my dog walking along Jindera Creek. And I noticed how many species of birds there were along the creek compared to some of the other areas around my suburb. And I started to think about why this was. And I realized that there are so many different types of birds that use the waterways. The water birds associated directly with the water, birds associated with riparian vegetation like the reeds, like the reed warblers. And then you have all the other different types of woodland birds that use waterways for so many different reasons: for breeding, for shelter, for cool during the summer months. And this makes them very popular with bird watchers. And all these different birds have very different habitat requirements. So things like the reed warblers will use the reeds and the rushes. Egrets will use the mudflats. Little woodland birds will use the dense shrubs around the creek banks. So, and the more types of habitats you find in one location along the waterway, the more birds you're likely to find. And birds tend to prefer going from tree to tree, as Laurie mentioned earlier. So this makes riparian habitats really important because these tends to be the areas in agricultural landscapes where you find the remnant vegetation. So I was involved in a tracking project with CSIRO, radio tracking, where we tagged multiple birds found in Calma Nature Reserve. And we found that the waterways or the Molonglo River was really important for birds for many different reasons. So this Rufous Whistler juvenile, it was born in Calma Nature Reserve, grew up there, and then suddenly it used the river to leave the nature reserve and to disperse. And then this black-faced cuckoo shrike, on the other hand, sort of stayed in Calma Nature Reserve. It was doing daily trips down to the river, either for food or water or various other reasons. But they don't only use waterways to move along the landscape. Sometimes it's the destination in big migrations. So Laurie has done a lot of work on the Latham snipe at Jarrabumba wetlands, and they've tracked these Latham snipe going all the way to Japan and coming back. And they use kind of the swampy meadows and flooded grasslands and wetlands. So all these different birds use rivers for different reasons, but not all rivers are equal. So as Laurie mentioned earlier, with the mess it up and slow it down, you have these beautiful, messy woodland habitats around waterways. And then you get areas where the remnant vegetation is just restricted to the river corridor, so in a narrow band, surrounded by paddocks that are quite bare. Then you have habitats where there are just a few scattered trees along the creek bank, isolated and quite far apart. And then you get habitats where there are no trees whatsoever, and it's really simple and quite eroded, and not much there for birds to use. So researchers in Southeast Queensland decided to test how these different landscapes would impact bird diversity. So you have, they looked at areas where there was quite a large area of woodland surrounding the creek line, and they looked at both ungrazed and grazed areas. They also looked at areas where there was that narrow band of connected vegetation along the creek banks in grazed and cropped areas, as well as isolated paddock trees in grazed and cropped areas. So I'll just talk you through these graphs. So you have species richness, or the number of species found in those areas. And then you have the species abundance, which is the total number of birds found in each survey. And then each of these different categories down the bottom corresponds to the different habitat types here. So in the woodland areas, surprise, surprise, you found the highest number of species and the highest number of birds. And then when you went to the narrow bands of vegetation, you found slightly lower diversity of birds and abundance. And then finally, with just the scattered trees, you found the lowest species richness abundance, though there was a slight difference between cropped and grazed areas in this case. So overall, they found that the amount of riparian vegetation played a huge role in the total bird abundance and diversity. So the wider the site, the more birds you'd find. And they also found that landscape context, or land use, and also the connectivity played a smaller role in the bird abundance and diversity. So with all this, they were looking at remnant trees and vegetation found along the creek lines. But what happens when you revegetate these areas? Do the birds come back? So this is exactly what Greening Australia's Birdwatch study was aiming to find out. So Greening Australia teamed up with the Canberra Ornithologists group in 2000, and they surveyed 133 different revegetation sites, as well as control sites. And then they went back to the same sites in 2008 and 2011 to see how these changed over time. So in the first year, they found an astonishing 110 different species using the revegetation sites. And the top 20 candidates were these ones here, with the beautiful superb fairy wren topping the list. And they also found quite a few threatened species using the revegetation sites, which was really encouraging. When they analysed which sites had the highest diversity, they found that they found more bird species in larger sites, wider sites, and this was particularly important for breeding of woodland birds. So the wider the site, or the bigger the block, the more birds were breeding in that habitat. They also found the most bird species in older sites with more complex vegetation structure, and sites that were closer to larger remnants. And it was interesting that some species only were found in remnants and some preferred revegetation, which comes back to different birds needing different things. Generally, over time, they found that each site increased in bird diversity over time. There were some winners, some losers, but generally there were more birds found in the older sites. And I decided to test this with some of our rivers of carbon sites because the previous birdwatch sites weren't necessarily for riparian areas. So I was lucky enough to find a property where there were 3 different ages of revegetation along the same stretch of river, which made them really comparable. So in the youngest site, there were only 4 species of bird present, and these tended to be the larger birds or birds like swallows that can move really fast through the landscape. Then when you got to the older sites, the 20-year-old plus site, you tend to find much more of the smaller birds. So you've got the wrens, the silver eyes, you start to get some of the honey eaters coming in, and then birds like the grey shrike thrush, which need a quite complex vegetation structure and leaf litter. But trees aren't everything, so some birds, like the waders, would love sites like this and wouldn't necessarily need to plant any trees here. So what does this all mean for management and restoration? So if you want to attract a large diversity of birds to your property, protect these riparian real estate areas. And because these old, especially the old trees, take a really long time to grow. Then if you want to boost the amount of vegetation around the creek, you can add plants through revegetation, but you just have to give it some time to have an impact on the bird community. And when you revegetate, the wider the better, and this is especially important for woodland birds. And it's important to also create complex and varied habitats, especially adding tall shrubs. So tall shrubs are really important for small woodland birds, and they actually act as a deterrent for species like the noisy miner, which are really aggressive and tend to drive out all other birds. So why would you want to do all this and attract lots of birds to your properties? So birds are really important for plant pollination, especially for native plants. They're really good at seed dispersal, and water birds can even bring back water plants to creeks where those water plants are missing because they get trapped in their feathers. Birds are also really good at insect control for all plants, and they're so beautiful, so why wouldn't you? All right, well, I'll pass over to Ian now, who can talk you through some of the Habitat Hollow work he's been working on.
Thanks, Lucy. That's terrific. And that picture there is of Nankeen night herons, which I've never seen actually in real life, but I just thought that photo was absolutely stunning. We'll now move on to Ian, who's going to be talking to us about habitat hollows, but please keep your questions coming in the chat function and Lucy can answer them for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks to Lucy, Laurie and Joanne for having me today. And all of you, thanks for joining. It's a great group we've got together, it looks like. So yeah, I guess as Joanne's actually named my presentation, thank you, Joanne, it's all about real estate today. Yeah, I'm sure there's some sort of analogy here with auctioneers and gavels and things, but Joanne will have to think about that while I'm talking. I guess I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our work we've been doing in the Southern Highlands through the Wall to Wollondilly project. And I guess that's around both protecting the habitat that exists still in that particular part of the world, and they're focused on the Wingecarribee River, so a riparian system there. But also what we're looking at to try and improve some of the habitat values of that area. And I guess just before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge in particular here the New South Wales Environmental Trust, who has funded the Wall to Wollondilly project, and there's a range of other partners in this project, which I might come back to. So is that right? I can't actually see my screen very well. In essence, though, this is an image of the Wingecarribee River. It's a beautiful river which flows from the eastern escarpment up near sort of Robertson in the Southern Highlands down into the Wollondilly River. It's a very diverse system. It goes through quite a few different soil types and geologies, and it has a really great kind of focal area, a bit like what Lucy was just saying in terms of it is really the connection in some of the agricultural parts of the landscape there. So just to sort of cite where we're talking about here, yeah, so hopefully you can see my cursor. So as I was saying, so if you know the Southern Highlands, I think some people are from the Southern Highlands, so you know it better than me on this call. you're going from that eastern escarpment down through the major towns near Mossvale, Back of Barrel and Berrima, and then flowing down through until the confluence there with the Wollondilly River. Yeah, it's got some beautiful sections, and then there are some more degraded sections of that river. And just briefly, just to step back a little bit there, this project fits into the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, which is an initiative that covers a great swathe of the eastern seaboard of Australia, recognising the excellent quality of vegetation and fauna and flora through much of the ranges there directly around the Great Dividing Range, but also near the coast, and that being a real focal area for wildlife. And I guess this is called the Southern Highlands Link. It forms a small part of that Great Eastern Ranges project, and we're trying, I guess, here to use the Wingecarribee River to link up the areas you can see here, the nice bush that still exists in the east, and this flows down into the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area on the west. So it's a really important linkage, and it has all these great values as a river, which we'll talk about a little bit too. So I guess what I mentioned just at the start, but before we go into the intricacies of habitat hollows, I guess just to really highlight this, and I think I'll come back to this again at the end. So we're coming up with new ways of creating habitat for animals that need hollows for breeding or for other purposes. But as well as we can do this at this stage, it's difficult, it's expensive, it's dangerous, comparative to just leaving what we already have there. So I guess my take-home message, if nothing else from today, is that the real estate that's already there, our high-rise real estate, is what we need to look after in the very first instance, because it's many hundreds of years, beyond the time frame of what we can talk about in terms of our funding cycles, in terms of our revegetation work. So really, if we have this in our landscape, whether that's, here we've got a standing live tree which has got some lovely hollows in it, but there's other examples where it could be a dead tree fulfilling this purpose. And there, I guess, the parts of the landscape that people often want to clean up, so to speak. But really, those large old trees, whether they be living or dead, are the absolute cornerstones of habitat for many of our animals, and we just need to really try and look after them when we can in any part of our landscape, but particularly around the rivers. So I guess if we've done what we have in many parts of the agricultural landscape, then we don't have that luxury. We do actually have to go back and do some restoration work. So this is some of the work we have been doing along the Wingecarribee River up there in the Southern Highlands. This is close to Bowral, and a project we got underway with last year. It went through a summer of drought after that, and then had flood waters coming up above, probably above where these people's heads are, actually, all the way over that fence. There was kilometres, the floodplain's a kilometre wide. But we still had remarkable survival rate through that site. The landholder there was exceptionally engaged and did a fantastic job to keep those plants alive through that really dry, hot summer when everything was on fire. It's looking great already, that site, and will look better in the future. I guess it's not exactly the same site. It's a slightly further up the river, this particular image, but just to show you what we're aiming for, I guess this is about a 15-year-old site near Cecil Hoskins Reserve, if people know that area. So yeah, that's what we're looking to try and do in terms of some restoration work there on and around the river, for exactly the reasons that Lucy was just explaining for birds. We focused, in terms of our habitat creation work, not actually on birds so much as on some of the small mammals that require hollows. Obviously, birds do too, and there's some great programs around about birds. But in this case, we were looking at mammals most of all, and we had some great. We've had some great target species too. Some really cute furry things, including gliders, possums, and microbats. I guess we're trying to establish sort of a proof of concept in that area. Many of you will have seen or worked with sort of boxes, if you like, so nest boxes of various descriptions, whether they be for birds or other mammals or other animals. They can have a role in habitat restoration work for fauna, but they do have some drawbacks. Again, as anyone who's worked with them will know, in terms of maintenance, in terms of some of their thermal properties in particular. If you can imagine a box sitting on a sunny spot, it can heat up and cool down very rapidly, and I guess that's posed a problem, and there's been lots of research done around the issues that can pose. And you know, the most extreme version of that is that it can actually cook the animals inside those boxes. So habitat hollows, which I'll sort of explain what that is, are sort of an alternative to those sort of habitat structures. So here, I guess there's a bit of an example. This is a box that was made for bat habitat. It's got sort of suitable features potentially for inhabitation by a microbat, and we've sort of seen those used in the landscape. This is one that was used actually in the Barrel area. Pardon me. And then I guess we can see here on the right what we're aiming for in terms of what we're doing with our habitat hollows work. So they're also known as chainsaw hollows. So this is putting habitat that is, I guess, more like a natural hollow into in this case, a dead tree. This is a standing dead tree that has, as I mentioned before, potentially more of the same properties as a natural hollow would in terms of, you know, heating up, cooling down, all that sorts of things. They can be actually quite quick to do if you have a skilled operator. And I guess they should, not always, but they should require less maintenance. You can imagine if you have some of these nest boxes on trees, that if you don't maintain them, then their life is quite short. You know, if there's wind, if there's rain, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong with them. Tree growth, etc. There's if you do it properly, you can do it. You can do it really well with boxes, but yeah, in some instances at least, the habitat hollows can perform the job for a longer time, more like a real hollow would. So I guess in terms of the creation process, now I'm going to try this, Shuan. Are you happy for me to give this a go? So what do I need to do? I need to stop sharing, and then hopefully you'll be able to see me. Can you see me? You're muted, but I'm taking that you can. Hopefully everyone can see me. So I'm just going to show you a couple of bits of wood.
If everyone would like to actually just click on speaker view in the top right hand corner of their screen, and then when Ian speaks, he will come into the main frame. Yep, great.
All right, so just briefly, I'll keep moving, but I guess you have a log. Here's a log. Everyone can see a log. So what we want to do is, you can kind of see it in that picture, but we have a log. With a saw, we can take off a faceplate like so. So then you've got a log, faceplate, log, looks like that. With a saw and a faceplate, this is as close as we can get to show and tell in a Zoom world, I reckon. We've got a faceplate here. And then you can create an area inside where you're going to hopefully do some hollowing out. And lastly, we've got a faceplate. Take the faceplate off, and you can then hollow that out so that you've got room to get an animal into. Put the faceplate back on like this, and then you can create an entry. In this case, it's actually an entry for probably a glider or a small possum, like a ringtail possum. So you can then reattach that. You've got an area inside, obviously. And I guess really importantly, you make these different sizes, different shapes for different animals. Yeah, exactly. I just saw it on there that you can make them for different animals. All right. I'll try and share again. How do I do that?
It's very impressive. You'll have to go back down to share the screen.
I think I've got it.
Wow,
All right.
magic.
So again, just to reiterate, so what I showed you is basically a version of this type of hollow here. So there'd be quite a large hollow made inside there. Whereas over here we have, this is for a microbat. So you have probably a smaller cavity inside there, a different shaped cavity. There's different structures actually inside there too. And then you'll have an entry here. And this is actually, it's going to be used for two reasons. It's going to be an entry for very small microbats. But what we've actually found in the project is that the microbats are actually using that to communicate out and into. So you can see sometimes these microbats are using these areas to for other reasons too. So again, testing the bounds of technology. Here we go. So you can hear that too. So that's I guess that's our results page of our paper. So we've had remarkable success actually in this process with the range of our target species, and we've been we've managed to get quite good uptake of the habitat hollows that we've constructed in some areas at least. Just very briefly, I think I'm running low on time, but for those of you who know the Highlands, this is Berrima, one of the towns in the Highlands. Bowral is just up here, and Moss Vale is down the bottom here. So you can see we've also targeted a few different areas. We've targeted what is more remnant bush, better habitat, and existing hollows, and then some of the more agricultural and urban areas here and here. And we've had slightly differing results through the different areas, partly through the resource availability for trees that we could use, but also because of the surrounding landscape context. I guess in terms of what we found, here's a microbat, long-eared bat in one of the hollows. We're finding it's working for the target species. We're not getting any what people sometimes term junk species. So either feral species that can sometimes take up the space where natives would, or more common native species that can likewise, I guess, take the place of some of our more threatened species, or even just lesser seen species. So because we're constructing the hollows in a particular way, so that they can't necessarily be used by those other species, I guess. We're looking into next steps in terms of trying to really get down to the nitty-gritty of which species of microbats. That's actually where we're heading with this project. We can form habitat for. We're getting some common species of microbats. We're looking for some slightly different techniques to get in other species. So stay tuned for that. And that's where I changed back over to someone else. But just I guess to reiterate, with any of our riparian systems, whether it be creating habitat hollows, protecting habitat hollows, protecting the native vegetation that's already there, always our approach needs to be to protect what we have first, and go for this restoration approach second. Thanks again to Rivers of Carbon team for inviting me along to speak about this today. And please, I've missed a bit of content there, so please ask any questions as you feel.
Thanks, Ian. If you'd like to flip to the last slide, we can just have that sitting there so people can see that we do have a range of resources that cover this material, and the Rivers of Carbon website is a great place to go to. We'll be adding to that material this video from today, along with some extra information from both Ian, Lucy and Lori. So if you want to follow up on that, you're certainly most welcome. And the final slide there, Ian, is just the various websites of the projects. We work very, very collaboratively. So there's a number of websites there for you to choose from. But again, just like to make that special recognition of the New South Wales Environmental Trust, who's really supported Rivers of Carbon for many, many years and enabled us to do some terrific projects. We have a few minutes to answer some questions. So Ian, I've got a couple here for you. Firstly, one from Carrie, who's asking, can you use logs like the ones you showed and attach them to trees like a nest box?
Yeah, that's a great question, and is one of the kind of extended bits of information for when I have an hour and a half to talk about habitat holders. Yeah, so you can, but we haven't actually done that in this process. We're looking at doing that in our next stage, is doing exactly that. And there's some obvious advantages to that in that it gives me an opportunity to say something else that I wanted to say before. I guess don't try this at home. The people we've had working on this are, we've had a very, very good ecologist who's done a lot of this sort of work, and a team of trained arborists who obviously are trained in all the safety aspects of what's required, both climbing, using saws up trees, using saws on the ground for that matter. So please, I guess, again, this is not a recommendation for something to go and try in your place. It's really, it can be quite dangerous. There's issues with putting weakness into an existing dead or alive tree too. So, you know, there's a lot of aspects to cover. So please don't try it at home. But yeah, absolutely. If you can use logs, it actually does make it safer in some ways. So they're similar, I guess, to a box in that you could then take them up and attach them at the right height. It's quite important which height you're putting in these structures depending on the species you're targeting. But that is an approach, and it's actually, yeah, it's something I'd really like to try actually in this project in the next phase.
So just a couple of follow-ons from that. A couple of people have asked for measurements and guidelines for the hollow construction, and I think based on what you've said there, we'll provide some information about that. But right now, this is something that you do need a skilled arborist. I've seen pictures of people actually doing this, and they're all strapped up in a tree. Where is he? Keep going. There's another one where you've got the guy.
Sorry. Yeah, that's right.
There he is, up a tree. So it is quite a skilled job. But with any of these sort of experimental projects, we're really then trying to move to another phase where we can encourage people to access the information so that we can get those measurements. But we're not quite there yet. Another really good question from Callie, Ian, was around whether the hollows are less susceptible to mites than maybe the nest boxes, and did that factor in the fact that it's natural material as opposed to, I guess, man-made material in terms of longevity?
Yeah, for sure. I'll just go back to that previous question. So you can see probably here on the screen there is a guide. This is for nest boxes. It's not for habitat hollows. Yeah. But the information is very similar in terms of dimensions, entries, etc. And that's discussed in some detail in this book. In this book that's been put together by Wingecarribee Shire Council. And so when the slides go up, you can have a look at that link there, and that should cover off on some of that information. In terms of what was just mentioned there in terms of mites, etc., I haven't actually come across that particular aspect in discussions around the benefits versus the difficulties or negatives of these different structures. But I guess the natural materials, you have a lot of, there are some other really great things about using the habitat holders versus boxes in terms of, those properties. And there are some good reasons around, I guess, having a structure that is able to release waste and have more consistent properties that animal might be used to than, for example, a pine nest box, which is what many of them end up being made out of. Again, just to be clear, there are some really, really good nest box designs and really good people working on nest boxes. And some of those are excellent. They're really good and getting fantastic results. So it's not to say that nest boxes should not be considered ever, but I think possibly they maybe just need to be a bit we need to be a bit more careful about how we're putting up nest boxes, when we're putting up nest boxes, and who we're doing it for.
So Ian, I'm thinking that in terms of the follow-on from this, I might get you to pull some of that information together and we can have it sitting on the page, because you know, a lot of people want to do the right thing, and often it's hard when you don't have that expertise to know which nest box where.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah,
that would be really good.
Just going back to this, this is a great guide. It's quite straightforward in terms of it's not overcomplicated, but it has a really great amount of information around basically all these questions, and specifically for nest boxes. Yeah.
Terrific. And I can see there from our friend Michael from the New South Wales Environmental Trust actually has popped up a PDF there, Hollows for Habitat. Looks like it was the proceedings of a get-together talking about this very topic. So thanks very much for that, Michael. I'll make sure I keep that link and pop it in with the resources. We've got a few minutes left. Is there anyone else who has a question they'd like to ask? You can unmute yourself if you would like, or raise your hand and I'll look out for you. No, I'm just scrolling through. Okay, well, I would like to say thank you very, very much for joining us today. We actually had over 90 people registered, which is fantastic. And we did encourage people to register even if they couldn't turn up, so that they can then get access to the information. And thank you, Lucinda. It's our first one as we venture into riparian real estate. I'm really pleased you've enjoyed it. And if we know that they're successful, then we'll continue on. So we've got frogs, and we've got other fish, and a whole range of things that we can talk about. So we can certainly keep the seminars coming. Next week we're focusing on something quite different, and that's roads and tracks, and how best to situate them on your property. So you both be very welcome to join us on that one. And then a few weeks after that we have another seminar focusing on stock and waterways. So when we follow up with you as a result of you registering with us, you'll get an option to join our newsletter, which we put out every month. It's a free newsletter. It covers a whole range of topics, as well as just being able to access these videos. So we're certainly not going to spam you. You get the option to opt in, but we will like to stay in touch with you and welcome you to become part of our community. So thanks again to Lucy and Ian and to Lori for working with me today on putting the presentation on. I hope you have a really great rest of your day, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you join us on the newsletter and on our upcoming seminars. So thank you very much.